The beam of a dive light slid across a ship's bell over netting that draped like curtains and down into a hold where crates lay burst open. Silt lifted in storms and settled on porcelain bowls, beer bottles, rubber boots, and the rusted ribs of a truck tire. The passage narrowed. A diver's breath rose in silver beads along a steel ceiling. On the bulkhead, a fuse box still carried stenciled numbers. In the next compartment, a bicycle leaned on a wall as if someone had left it for a quick errand and never came back. The diver eased around a hatch, checked the gauge, and followed the line into cargo, where a single tank lay strapped to a skid. The hull creaked in a way only old ships creaked, a low groan that traveled through bone. Outside the jagged hole where a bomb had entered, blue water waited. Inside, time held still. 2 decades earlier, the lagoon had been a nervous, busy harbor. In the 1930s, Japan fortified the Caroline Islands and turned the atoll Westerners called Truk, locals called it Chuk, into a forward base. Airstrips, fuel tanks, repair shops, and moorings expanded across the islets. By late 1943, cruisers and merchant steamers cycled through to refuel. Pilots trained overhead. Freighters carried torpedoes, shells, and aviation gasoline. The harbor looked secure behind its reef, but American submarines had already cut into traffic, and reconnaissance flights photographed decks crowded with cranes and cargo. In February 1944, American commanders decided to strike the base before pushing toward the Marianas. The plan was fast and direct. Task Force 58, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's carriers, battleships, and screens would drive in, launch wave after wave, and leave the anchorage wrecked within 48 hours. Intelligence suggested that major Japanese combatants had moved out, but tankers, transports, and smaller warships still filled the moorings. Just before dawn on February 17th, carrier fighters clawed into a gray sky and headed for the lagoon. They swept the airfields at Eton and Param, turning parked aircraft into flame and chasing what few rose to fight. After the fighters came the torpedo and dive bombers. Avengers ran in low, Dauntlesses rolled into steep dives. Trails of foam carved bright lines toward anchored ships. Bombs stepped up decks from bow to bridge. Fuel tanks burned. Plumes of smoke stacked above the reefs. On the water, crews fired back with everything they had. Machine guns, light flak, and rifles braced against railings. In minutes, the lagoon turned from mirror calm to a grid of wakes, oil, and debris. The violence carried names that divers later learned by heart. Ikoku Maru, loaded with troops and munitions, took a direct hit and vanished in a fireball. Its shock felt miles away. Fujikawa Maru sank upright, machine shops intact, spare propellers hanging on their pegs. Heian Maru, a submarine tender, settled on her side with racks of long-lance torpedoes riding out the war in silence. Shinkoku Maru went down with a tiled operating room that would still glow green in a shaft of daylight. The freighter San Francisco Maru rolled to a stop so deep that only trained divers could reach its forward deck, where 3 Type 95 tanks sat locked in rust and coral. By the time the last American strike groups turned for home on February 18th, the count was heavy. Reports varied by source, but the totals landed in the same band. More than 40 ships sunk and roughly 250 to 275 aircraft destroyed on the ground and in the air. The lagoon's piers, fuel farms, and workshops stood mangled or burning. The raid severed a hub that had fed Japanese operations across the Central Pacific. For people on the islands, the days after Hailstone brought wreckage on coral and sheens of oil pushed by wind into mangroves. Crews searched the shallows for survivors. With supply lines cut and air power broken, the garrison endured hunger and disease while the war rolled west toward Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Many of the ships stayed where they sank, the lagoon turning them from wreckage into landmarks known first by fishermen and later by visitors. In 1969, cameras and world attention returned with Jacques Cousteau's expedition. His film showed divers easing through cargo holds, stacked with porcelain and bottles, gliding past telegraphs frozen at full, and swimming over open breaches where shells had once slid into place. The Ghost Fleet drew divers. Local guides learned each hull and taught visitors how to enter and how to exit. The water preserved details the air would have erased. Inside Fujikawa Maru, daylight cut shafts through a jagged hole and found lathes, propeller blades, and stamped spare parts. At Heian Maru, rows of torpedoes waited in their cradles, their bronze heads soft with growth. On Shinkoku Maru, a galley stove gathered coral and soft coral, waved from a hatch, like weeds in wind. The San Francisco Maru demanded deeper training and careful planning. The reward was a silent deck, where 3 tanks kept watch in a way that made even veteran divers keep one hand on their depth. The lagoon also held risk. The silt inside tight corridors could blind a diver in seconds. Cables and nets still snared careless fins. Some compartments contained munitions. Depths ranged from easy to unforgiving, and nitrogen and oxygen planning turned every dive boat into a classroom. Respect for graves made the rules clear. No souvenirs, no prying, no moving bones. Many who visited came for history and left with a sense that they had walked through a sealed room of the past. As decades passed, a slower threat emerged from inside the steel. Fuel trapped in bunker tanks and pipes began to seep as plates thinned. Rainbow slicks marked certain sites on calm mornings. Engineers and conservation groups mapped the hulls, estimated volumes, and debated how to mitigate leaks without damaging the reef that had guarded the fleet. For Chukizi families, the fleet formed part of daily life. Boats moved along routes that threaded between masts, hidden just below the surface. Elders told what they remembered of the raid and the long shortages that followed. Guides taught younger crews the runs to each wreck and the currents that shifted with wind and tide. When storms blew in from the east, the color of the water matched old photographs. Slate under a low sky. Underwater, the quiet had its own weight. A telegraph pointer rested at a head. A cup lay upside down on a table. A radio room held coils and dials long since colonized by coral. In a companionway, a shoe sat in a corner where current never reached. Nothing moved except fish and the slow fall of silt. The fleet did not feel like myth. It felt like work interrupted. Shipwrights' bolts, clerks' ledgers shut mid-entry, engines cooling to the same temperature as the sea. The record of the attack remained precise. February 17th and 18th, 1944, carrier fighters to win the air, then strikes on ships and installations, and a Pacific campaign that leapt forward after the raid. Back at the bell in the wreck's shadow, the diver checked time and pressure and flowed out through torn plates into the open. The ship fell away, softened by coral. In the blue distance, another hull loomed, stack, mast, bridge, aligned by gravity rather than command. On the surface, a skiff rocked at anchor. The story of the Ghost Fleet rose with every exhale, past gauges and hoses, into air that smelled faintly of fuel and salt, and drifted across the lagoon that had once been the most guarded harbor in the Central Pacific. Thank you for listening to The Sunken Ledger. Subscribe for more true stories from the depths.